Russian leader Vladimir Putin's new decision has shocked the country. The reactions after the mobilization announcement cost an arrow. Putin's dictatorial regime in Russia is on the verge of collapse. The developments of the war continue to have major effects in. The people are outraged that Vladimir Putin must leave the president's office. The people are determined not to re-elect Putin, who has been in power without change. Putin has been Russia's president for many years, and it has historically been bad for a ruler to stay in power for too long because democracy disappears in the event of such a long spree, and a dictatorial regime comes into play, which we have seen many examples of in the war from the past to the present. This is exactly what happened to Russia. Putin has now completely taken over the media and bans any news that might be against his interests. For example, since the outbreak of the war, any anti-war news has been interfered with which supports this narrative. As a result of these pressures and interventions, opposition leaders have no power against this administration. Putin, who controls the media and the judiciary, thinks that he will be able to keep his power as a result of the regime he has put the country under. However, popular uprisings, the biggest concern of dictatorial regimes, have started to take place in Russia since these uprisings are considered to be the only major factor that can destroy dictatorial. We see that we are approaching the end of this regime. Putin is trying to pull all the strings, continues to receive reactions from the people. The Russian army's incursion into Ukrainian territory, despite the restrictions and control of the media, has caused an uprising among the people. Putin's failure to fulfill the promises he made to his people has also increased his reactions rapidly. Their failures on the battlefield and Ukraine's ID have further galvanized the people. As a result, anger against Putin is growing like an avalanche. The people, who could only get news of the huge losses on the Russian side of the war from foreign, have now taken their protests to a new level. The continuation of the war at full speed, despite all their protests, has infuriated the Russian people. It is also known that Russia's troop losses in Ukraine exceeded 145,000. Then the news that 300,000 citizens would be forcibly conscripted into the war against Airville as a result of the partial. As a result of all this, the Russian people, who had reached the limits of their tolerance, took to the streets and begun to demand their rights. As a result, a major uprising broke out, but the Russian security forces, who never hesitated to use force, called this uprisings as much as possible. The protesters are back on the streets, growing eggs, potentially at the number of citizens conscripted into the army increases the protests, which continue mainly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, continue to receive harsh reactions from Putin. The sanctions as a result of these reactions are getting heavier at the same speed. Although he always stands behind his anti-war rhetoric, the fact that the war continues to take lives has infuriated the people. The streets are filled with angry people who say they will no longer support Putin. For Putin, who does not want to have to deal with the problem of a major uprising again, his worst fear has come true. The Russian people gathered in front of the Kremlin palace continue to emphasize their opposition to the war. Putin, who did his best to end these uprisings as soon as possible, gave full authority to the security forces. The security forces, who do not hesitate to use these powers, started to detain the protesters. The Human Resources Organization says the number of these arrests reached 4,300 in 1 week. According to a media company known to be based in Russia, the number of detentions and arrests has already exceeded 10,000. Despite all these threats to Russian people supported by opposition, authorities and other countries are on the streets. Despite the use of force by the authorities, despite the many beatings, the people do not give up there. People continue together and make their voices heard in many places such as the Kremlin, palace, squares, and subways. Putin's statement that those involved in the uprisings will face prison sentences prove that he only cares about his own rule, not the people. Putin ignores the wishes and complaints of the people who elected him as their president. The people, who are not silent about all this, continue to meet in the streets at night and announce their opposition to the war by spray painting on the votes. Although Putin's reaction to this turmoil has become increasingly support from other countries, continuous support countries such as France, Turkey, Georgia, Australia, Canada, and the UK, Germany have openly expressed their support for the protests. Alex Navalny, who is known to be against Putin, also continues to support these protests. He has previously been imprisoned for slandering Putin. He is making his voice heard by calling on citizens who have been and he urged the Russian people to continue their cause. There are increasing reports that soldiers are being devoted and many of them are trying to flee from the front. At the same time, protests in the cities are spreading to the front. Even commanders have been known to flee the war and leave the front lines. Although the number of commanders making official statements is limited to a few, many commanders and soldiers are said to have fled without making it official. Putin's falling from grace and the harsh conditions do not have a positive effect on this attitude of the soldiers. On the contrary, the more these reports spread and the harsher the situation became, the more soldiers attempted to flee. These soldiers, who were recruited under the name of mobilization and not of their own volition, are ready to escape, to save themselves whenever they have the opportunity. Soldiers fleeing from the front line state that they are doing their military service and disra, in addition to lack of ammunition. It was shocking to hear them say that they had trouble even feeding themselves. The fact that they said they had only one meal a day in this forced military service drill reaction. Even the government that authorized the war did not anticipate that the war would last so long. The statement made at the beginning of the war was that the war would last only a few weeks, maybe a few months. The promise was that no Russian soldier will be, but the war has been going on for a year, and 145,000 Russian soldiers have already lost their lives. As the soldiers point out, it is not only the reluctant citizens who have been brought in by force, but also inexperience of the commanders that makes things more difficult for Russia. In addition to Russia's uncontrolled and reluctant war, Ukraine's fight for independence is prevailing. Moreover, many countries are supporting Ukraine in. It's just, Russia is a state of constant chaos. This state of chaos is blamed on Putin, who is more concerned with his own dominance than the interests of the country. Putin is angry at the people for protesting and rebelling against their own rulers. The result is a government that is increasingly rigid and far removed from what the people want. The media and the Russian people's characterization of Putin as a dictator is proving more and more. The fact that Ukraine is so far ahead in the war brings fear to the Russian forces. The Ukrainian forces, which make the best use of the aid campaigns mobilized by many countries and exhibit them on the battlefield, continue to get ahead. Day by day work is being carried out everywhere to his cruelty, that Putin inflicted on the Russian army and its people. There are reports that signatures have been collected in many parts of Russia and presented to the Kremlin in order to end. Next news. The Ukrainian army has launched the operation that Vladimir Putin. The 50,000-strong Ukrainian army has started advancing to the Korky region. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has issued a final warning to Russian troops on Ukrainian territory. Why doesn't Putin, who has suffered so many casualties on Ukrainian soil, explain his losses on Ukrainian soil? The war between Russia and Ukraine has been going on for over a year, according to American and Ukrainian NT. The casualties of the Russian army on Ukrainian soil are quite high. The Russian government remains silent on this issue and does not want to make any statement throughout this ongoing war. The Ukrainian government releases updated casualty data every month while the Russian government continues to remain silent on this issue. The Ukrainian General Staff announced the losses in Ukrainian territory, which Russia refrained from announcing since the beginning of the war until now. 165,000 Russian soldiers have lost their lives on Ukrainian territory. This figure does not include the wounded. The number of soldiers who were wounded and taken to Russia for treatment is unknown. It was also announced that 4,787 are marked vehicles, 1035 artillery systems, 356 multiple launch rocket systems, 192 anti-aircraft systems, 391 aircraft, 256 helicopters, 3,664 vehicles and fuel tanks, 21 ships, 1047 unmanned aerial vehicles, 65 pieces of special equipment, and 610 50 cruise missiles belonging to the Russian army were destroyed. British government officials stated that the Russian army used 60% of its missile inventory on Ukrainian territory, and the end of the Russian army is near. The fact that the Russian army is losing so much power on Ukrainian soil makes Vladimir Putin very. The Ukrainian leader, Zelensky, who wants to turn this situation into an opportunity, has launched a major operation to push back to invading Russian forces. However, before this operation, he gave a final warning to the Russian soldiers on Ukrainian territory, addressing the Russian soldiers occupying Ukrainian territory. Zelensky called on them to flee if they want to. Zelensky wants to strike the last blow to the Russian army by launching the offensive. He has been planning for a long time. The Ukrainian army is now seeking to retake the territories occupied by the Russian army. Zelensky said that they will take back the occupied Kherson in September. The Ukrainian army, which thinks that it now has enough firepower with the support it receives from America and Western countries, has more towards the Kharkiv region with some 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Explaining their goals, Zelensky stated that first, the carrier region will be completely cleared and then they will concentrate on the Luhan region. The Ukrainian leaders stated that if the occupying Russian troops are cleared from Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula will be the next target. Deliberation of Crimea from Russian occupation is a great success and victory for Ukraine. If the Ukrainian army captures Crimea, it means Russia is completely defeated in this war. The Russian army brings most of its troops to Ukrainian territory through Crimea. Thanks to the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, Russia can easily transport troops to Ukraine. If Russia loses Crimea, it'll be a matter of time before it loses this war. Let's now count to the details of the operation launched by the Ukrainian. With the order of Vladimir Zelensky, the majority of the soldiers in Ukrainian territory were sent to the city of Dnipro. The Ukrainian army, which massed troops here, started to move towards Kiev city with a battalion of 50,000 people. Kiev, one of the first occupied places in Ukraine, is very close to the Russian border. By capturing Kharkiv, Ukrainian forces want to completely secure the border between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian battalion of 50,000 people, which is on its way to the city of Kros, Nora in the Kharkiv region, organized a major operation against the Russian forces stationed in this region, completely surrounding the city. Ukrainian soldiers managed to squeeze the Russian soldiers stationed in Kros. Russian soldiers hiding in the abandoned houses in the region started to escape from the buildings when they saw the Ukrainian battalion of 50,000 people. The Ukrainian army won its easiest victory so far without any casualties leaving the city. The Russian forces continued to move away without even looking back. The Ukrainian soldiers who captured the region decided to settle in the headquarters established by the Russian army and stay here for a. The next target is thought to be the city of Mefa, which is very close to Kiev. If the Ukrainian army captures the city of Mefa, it'll be a matter of time before the Russian forces are cleared from the Kharkiv region. If the losses of the Russian army fighting on the territory of Ukraine continue to increase, the withdrawal of the Russian army from Ukraine in the near future will be inevitable according to American experts' research. Russian President Vladimir Putin cannot withdraw from Ukraine to avoid humiliation in the eyes of the world. And this situation is getting worse and worse for Russia. With the Russian army suffering so many casualties in Ukraine, it is difficult for Putin to recruit soldiers. That's why the Russian government has started to advertise for recruits online due to the losses of the Russian army in Ukraine and the TRO of Russian soldier. The Russian army started to search for contract soldiers online. Putin is trying to bring soldiers from the Middle East to join the Russian army. The Russian soldiers in Ukrainian territory canceled their contract and started to withdraw from Ukraine, leaving Putin no other choice. When the Russian government could not maintain the current number of Russian army, it started to try the remedy with such method. In recent days, you can see advertisements for volunteer soldiers and contract soldiers in many cities and websites in Russia. Russian government officials are trying to encourage Russian citizens to become soldiers by placing such advertisements all over the cities. Citizens with previous military training are being sent to Ukraine on a contract basis, while those who want to volunteer must first undergo a short. This desperate situation of the Russian army is on the agenda all over the world. In order to compensate for its losses, the Russian government has started to withdraw its troops from its base. In some countries, the Russian government is first trying to send the troops in Sia and Karabakh to Ukrainian territory. Also, the mercenaries of the Russian army in Syria were these mercenaries who were previously sent to Syria through the Wagner Company have now been recalled due to the difficulties of the Russian army. In addition, not only Russian mercenaries are being brought from Syria, it seems that Putin asked for help from the Assad regime in Syria. The Russian government has now opened mercenary centers for the Russian army. In some cities in Syria, Syrian soldiers are encouraged to apply to these centers in Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, Leadera, and that Syrian soldiers who want to join the Russian army will be paid between $300 and $600 per month. Some Syrian soldiers from the pro-regime forces known as applied to these centers and asked to join the Russian army. Those who applied and has previous military training will be taken to Ukraine after a short training at the Kamenn Basin. No one could have predicted that the Russian army would fall into such a bad situation. Now you can see a lot such of advertisements in Russian cities. Ukraine, which has taken the advantage, and the war between Russia and Ukraine has started to scare Vladimir Putin. Putin, who has difficulty finding soldiers for his army, is aware that he's starting to lose the war on Ukrainian. The Russian leader is playing all his trump cards to avoid losing success. Next intel, Battalion, Ukraine's most popular unit, dealt a major blow to Russian forces. The ASO battalion organized a secret operation and neutralized hundreds of Chechen soldiers. Xi leader Ram Kady Putin-class Chechen soldiers were ambushed in Ukraine due to the inadequacy of Russian intelligence. The Russian army, which occupied the Ukrainian territory very quickly at the beginning of no longer has its former strength. At the beginning of the war, Russian forces managed to push back the Ukrainian army from many regions. However, the Russian army, which has weakened as time passes, is now forced to defend. Instead of attacking, the Ukrainian army has greatly increased its strength with the support from allied countries. The Ukrainian army is organizing large-scale operations to retake the territories captured by the invading Russian. As Russian leader Vladimir Putin began to lose control over Ukrainian territory, he turned to his allies for help. Putin held talks with Alexander Lukashenko and Ramzan Kadyrov and requested military support for Ukrainian territory. Kadyrov, known as Putin's close friend, sent more than 100,000 church and soldiers to Ukraine without blinking an eye of hour. After a while, this number became insufficient. Cav declared mobilization in Chich, secretly from the whole world, and tried to recruit many Chan citizens into the. After Kadyrov's declaration of mobilization, many church and citizens started to protest against the war, but they could not prevent Kadyrov's decision. Although Kadyrov has sent more than 100,000 troops to Ukraine, this number is still not enough for Putin. In cooperation with the Afghani Prigo of the Russian mercenary company Wagner, Putin wanted to send Russian prisoners to fight in Ukraine. Prigo started to visit Russian prisons to recruit soldiers for the Russian. Although Putin sent Russian prisoners to fight against the Ukrainian army, this adds major consequences. After a while, the convicted soldiers began to create problems within the army and fled the front line. Russian prisoners were racist and treated Chin soldiers with whom they felt on Ukrainian soil as second class, which caused big problems. This caused great confusion within the Russian army, and Vladimir Putin prevented Chin soldiers and Wagner soldiers from being in the same headquarters. As a result of Putin's decision, Chin soldiers at a Russian headquarters and Zia were sent to move to another region. However, this military transport was ambushed by the Azov Battalion, known as the Ukrainian Army Special Forces. The Ukrainian intelligence service received information that church and soldiers from the ministry headquarters in Zia were to be transferred to another region. Ukrainian forces organized a reconnaissance flight with unmanned fighter jets in order to identify the route of the church and soldiers. The church and soldiers were planned to be sent to the backward front where Russian troops are concentrated. Ukrainian soldiers started following the Chi convoy with unmanned fighter. Having found a route used by the Chin soldiers, the Ukrainian army took action to ambush the Chin convoy. As of troops, the most popular battalion of the Ukrainian army were assigned for this operation, mobilizing with 600 troops. Die Azov Battalion was deployed in the Tav Novo. Ukrainian soldiers placed many mines and plastic explosives on the road where the Chechen KAVO would pass, then hid in the vote next to the highway and waited for the Chin soldiers to arrive. When 300-strong convoy arrived at the Novik Highway, the operation was launched. This convoy of 8 vehicles stepped on the mines planted by Ukrainian soldiers while driving on the highway, and there was a big explosion. Chin soldiers who started to flee with their vehicles, with the shock of the explosion start to. On all the mines planted by Azov troops one by one, church-on soldiers got out of their vehicles and took a defensive position. Seeing that church-on soldiers got out of their vehicles, Azov soldiers came out of their hiding places and took church-on soldiers in crossfire. The enemy forces who tried to hide behind armor vehicles were blocked and subjected to intense gunfire. The remaining church and soldiers jumped into armor vehicles and left the area in order to save their lives. As a result of this operation, 202 church and soldiers lost their lives. The ambush by Die Azov Battalion caused a great tension between Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Kadyrov. It was Putin's decision to separate Han soldiers and Wagner soldiers. Kadyrov was furious that Chin soldiers were taken out of the headquarters instead of Wagner soldiers. There was a verbal argument between Putin and Kadyrov, who met in the Kremlin palace. According to sources close to the Kremlin, Kadyrov said that Chin soldiers fighting in Ukraine were not valued. Party expressed the incompetence of the Russian intelligence service and Ukraine and spoke very harshly to the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gera. Kadyrov thinks that the commanders who have been leading the Russian army since the beginning of the war have not done their job well. For this reason, he demands that he be given command of all the troops in Ukraine. However, this demand has been rejected dozens of times by Vladimir Putin. Putin, who got angry after these words of Kadyrov, is said to have expelled Kadyrov from the palace. Recently, such operations against Russian forces on Ukrainian territory have become very frequent. Many Russian commanders in Ukraine, including the former commander of the Russian army, Sergei Ron, say that Russian intelligence is inadequate. Before Surrogate Ryan was dismissed, the Ukrainian army organized a major operation in Kyiv. Russian soldiers turned an abandoned hospital in Kyiv into a secret base and deployed 820 troops in the hospital. However, after the Ukrainian intelligence service learned that this hospital was a Russian base, the Ukrainian army launched 10 air operation here. More than 600 Russian soldiers were killed in this operation, carried out with 12 Hets missile. Russian intelligence, which failed to see the airstrike organized by the Ukrainian army, caused Sergei Ryan's anger. Slovak then went to Vladimir Putin and told him that Russian intelligence was very int and that they were not getting enough efficiency. However, Putin blamed Sergei Orkan for this operation organized by the Ukrainian army instead of Russian intelligence. Already after this, the Russian general was dismissed and replaced by Rykov. Putin does not want to hear any bad words about the Russian army, but even Russian commanders in Ukraine speak of a lack of coordination in the Russian army. Russian commanders say that there are too many recruits and inexperienced soldiers in the army, and that they have difficulties in controlling them. The Russian leader decided to partially mobilize 300,000 Russian citizens and sent them to fight in Ukraine. However, these soldiers had no knowledge of war. Russian prisoners sent to Ukraine by Prigozhin were also inexperienced. Even though Putin sent a large number of soldiers to Ukraine, we can say that all of these soldiers were worth 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Next news. Ukrainians operating on Russia's borders. Ukraine's priority over Russia has begun to advance into Russia. Russian invaders can no longer find a hole to escape. Ukraine, which Putin tried to invade, is now in Russia. Realizing what this could lead to, the Kremlin issued a red all. With the issuing of the red alert, the entire Russian army has begun to accuse troops in places where an attack could be launched. This major operation was carried out in New Russia. Russian soldiers were surprised. In the past days, Ukraine has dealt a huge blow to Russia. This blow was never expected by Russia. A big reason why it was not expected was that it was the first time an attack could be made inside Russia's borders. This attack caused huge uprisings in Russia. The Russian people and the Russian army said that after these attacks took place, their lives were no longer. The reason for such a reaction was that Putin talked about this war as something that would only last for a week. Now, in the first year of the war, it has become a dream to be able to invade Ukraine. Putin's absurd strategies and war policies have put Ukrainian forces so far ahead in the war that they can now intervene inside a country. This Ukrainian operation was reverberated around the most important point of such a big operation was that it could be carried out within Russia's borders. The Kremlin sounded a red alert as Russia faced an unexpected event. The operation we have described was planned in an incredible way. One of the biggest reasons for the successful competition of the operation is the intelligence shortage of Russian forces. The most important point for Ukraine to achieve the success is its ability to use bar-unaugmented aerial vehicles at maximum capacity. Using this capacity and building an incredible intelligence network. The intelligence network, which has been the most important point from the very beginning of the war, is also here. This operation against Russia's airbase has been on the agenda all over the Ukraine has improved itself considerably in terms of warfare with its recent victories. Ukraine, which has become stronger after the incoming gate, has almost completely expelled the Russian invaders from its territory. As Ukraine expelled the invaders from its territory, the regions where the conflicts took place have approached the borders of Russia. Aware of the situation, Ukraine failed to strike a big blow with this. This operation was to be carried out using the vulnerability of Russia's underdeveloped air defense systems. Ukraine, which has many weapons available so that it could attack the Yezd airbase within Russia's borders. After the intelligence it's received, thanks to us, when the US HIMARS missiles came close enough to the Ukrainian territory to attack the Yezd airbase from the closest point to the Russian border operation, plans begun to be made. As we mentioned, HIMARS missiles would be used in this operation. HIMARS, which can strike its target with incredible accuracy and great impact, showed itself once. Airbase is one of Russia's most important military zones. The importance of this military airbase is that most of the planes used for war take off from here. Ukraine would have done a great job if it had struck this globe against Russia and completed the operation successfully. The reason for this was that it would enable Russia to reduce its airstrikes considerably. Ukraine has started planning this. The operation using us HIMARS missiles was planned as follows. As it is known, Yi is a city bordering sea. The fact that it borders the sea shows us that it is one of the closest places to Ukraine. After Ukraine pushed the Russian invaders out of its territory, the city of Mariupol became militarily usable. The RS missiles were to be fired from Mariupol. HIMARS missiles fired from the area closest to the sea in the city of Mariupol have reached a position to hit their targets comfortably after Ukraine pressed the operation button. High Mars missiles started to be deployed in the Marpol region, unaware of anything. Russian troops had many fighter jets, helicopters, and large amount of jet fuel at the Ik air base. This blow cost Russia a lot of. With the deployment of HUMS missiles, Bar took off to provide one last intelligence. Bar proved that they were completely ready for the operation, saying that the Russian soldiers continued their work without understanding anything in the intelligence. They provided the deployed HUMS bombard airbase with a massive missile bar. As the missiles fell on the airbase, incredible explosions begun. Russian forces had no idea where the attack was coming from. Not knowing that this attack could come from Ukraine, Russian forces started to flee everywhere. Many fighter jets were blown up by the explosions. A few of the missiles hit warehouses where the jet fuel was stored. When these jet fuel were fired, there was another huge explosion thanks to the fighter jets and helicopters that flew into the air under the impact of the explosions. No Russian soldier could find a way out of this air base. The Ukrainian forces won a great victory by completely destroying the Yegay air. The neutralization of this airbase was of great importance for Ukraine. The reason why it was so important was that it was from here that the planes taking off to the regions where Russia's airstrikes were being carried out departed. This attack proved again how underdeveloped Russia's air defense systems are according to war analysts. The main reason why Russia suffered so many defeats, the weapons used in the Soviet Union were also used in this war. The Ukrainian forces, which demonstrated their ID at every point, proved how superior they are to Russia in terms of airstrikes. Putin was furious when he heard the news of this attack. Even Putin did not know that Ukraine was getting so close to Russia. Putin, who wanted to continue his invasions, now had to focus on protecting his own territory. The Kremlin raised a red alert with the news of these explosions and the damage done. It decided to invest heavily in the military industry in order to strengthen the air defense systems in its military headquarters against such an operation. With this decision, the military industry, which has spent millions of dollars, is causing a major economic crisis in the country. Putin, who spends millions of dollars to acquire the necessary equipment after each defeat, has no intention of ending this war. With many examples, Putin's styles of such occupation have fed up the entire Russian people. With the economic difficulties experienced, people have started to hardly meet even the needs necessary for human survival. The great difficulties in the Russian army cause Russian soldiers to revolt every day. The main reason for the revolt is the food shortage in the army. Russian soldiers fell on the agenda with the videos they shared on social media platform. Soldiers who even have trouble feeding seem to be fed up at Putin's absurd and wrong war policy. Russian soldiers are not only suffering from food shortages, but also nothing is being done about health. All city hospitals of the Russian state have now started to serve the soldiers. This is proof of how many soldiers of Russian army is. As the city hospitals are filled with soldiers, the health problems of the local people cannot be solved. Many doctors working as volunteers in Russia have started to set up health tents at certain points in the cities for permanent diseases. And diseases that have no solution in these tents, the health problems of the local people are tried to be solved. The whole war is called Russia and put in to end this war. Putin, on the other hand, does not care about anything and continues to harm his people and his country. Next sensational news. The history of the world has witnessed several destiny-changing turning points. Each turning point has given birth to a new understanding and new sight in a new world. The war between Ukraine and Russia is also witnessing breaking moments that will change world. Although Russia propagandized that the invasion, which characterized as a special operation, would last a very short time, this propaganda came to naught. A year has passed in the war, but Russia has still not finished this invasion attempt because the Ukrainian army did not let the Russian army pass with its superhuman effort. The prolongation of the war with each passing day has exhausted the patience of the Russian soldier. Russian soldiers do not want to fight anymore and are resorting to new methods to end the war. Let's take a closer look at these recent events. The Pioneer team is working hard to share with you the information it has gathered from authorities, local international sources. You can support the Pioneer team in their efforts to bring you the most critical information about the Ukraine-Russia war by using the super thanks. Since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian armed forces have been working hard to expel the Russian invaders from Ukrainian territory. This struggle has been uninterrupted due to the loyalty of the Ukrainian soldiers, the trust of the Ukrainian people in the Ukrainian army, and the faith of all the constituent parts of Ukraine and President Volodymyr. In Russia, the situation is quite different. Russian soldiers do not trust each other, nor do the Russian people trust the army, nor does anyone with Russian blood believe in war. Putin, in such an environment where all the negativities coexist, betrayals and intrigues easily find a space they need to spread. For some, it is betrayal. For others, it is seeing the truth and changing. The incredible events that Russia has been experiencing in recent days are being called betrayal by the Russians, but the protagonists of the events see it as seeing the truth. We have shared with you in our previous reports about mutant in the Russian army and soldiers leaving the army and returning home. But this time the situation is a little different. The subject of those reporters that the soldiers who left the Russian army joined the Ukrainian to end the occupation of the Russian army. Changing sides, which has been seen many times in the history of warfare, has also found its place in the war between Ukraine and Russia. The reasons why Russia soldiers joined the Ukrainian army are remarkable. The Ukrainian army is conducting operations to liberate occupied territories while respecting the ethics of foreign and human rights. The Ukrainian army's attitude towards Russia, soldiers who tried to kill Ukrainian soldiers before they were captured. It's an indication of this. Ukraine is aware that Russian soldiers do not want to fight and that Putin is forcing them to fight. Ukraine is also disturbed by the treatment of Russian soldiers who fight in unfamiliar geographies far away from their families. Therefore, Ukraine launched the I Want to Live project, offering a new life to Russian soldiers who do not want. The protagonists of our Sohar Russian soldiers who are fed up with their experience in the Russian army and reached the Ivan to Live hotline. The Russian soldiers who surrendered and became prisoners of Ukraine were treated in captivity in a way they never expected. The Ukrainian army treated them as if they had never been on the battlefield before, as if they had never harmed Ukraine. Russian soldiers who surrendered were given all the humanitarian. The Russian soldiers were surprised to see the humanitarian treatment they had not seen in Russian quarters because their commanders had told them that Ukrainians were barbarians and murderers. But what they heard and what they saw were very different. This experience changed their attitude towards the war. Russian soldiers still wanted the war to end, but now they wanted to end with Ukraine's victory. They were touched by the compassion and humanity that Ukraine, also seeing what the Russian occupation had cost while they were in Ukrainian territory, influenced the Russian soldiers' decision. This was the turning point of the war. The Russian soldiers showed great courage and declared their side. Yes, we are Russians, but first and foremost, we are human beings. We never accept what Putin is doing to occupy Ukraine. We want the war to end. So now we will take part in Ukraine's just. The fact that the righteousness of Ukraine's struggle was recognized and supported by Russian soldiers once enemies caused justified pride in Ukraine and great shame in Russia because all of Russia's arguments for war have collapsed. Russia, which characterized Ukraine as savage and barbaric, was shown to be savage and maverick by its own soldiers. Russia's soldiers who surrendered and joined the Ukrainian side are now in the ongoing fierce fighting in Bakhmut. Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian side are showing great efforts and successes. In Bakhmut, the two different bloodlines in the Ukrainian army serve as single purpose. That goal is the immediate withdrawal of the occupying Russia from the occupied territories. The story of these soldiers who will left the Russian army and join the Ukrainian army is just one example. In the one-year-long war, we have witnessed such incidents. The situation in which the Russian army finds itself causes Russian soldiers to justify Ukraine's struggle. Previously, the news of Russian soldiers supporting Ukraine at the very beginning of the war shook Russia to its core. The revelations of 7 officers of the Ministry Intelligence Unit of the 50th Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces dropped like above on the agenda. The Russian officers who were captured by the Ukrainian people in the Chernihiv regional revealed scandalous information about Russia. The statements of Sergei Galin, one of the 7 officers, reveal half Putin used Russian soldiers. According to Kin's statement, Russian soldiers were sent on the road for exercises before the invasion begun. Russian soldiers who had no idea that they were going to war became very shocked when they learned about. Although they had combat experience, it was frightening for them to be caught in such chaos. No help reached the Russian soldiers who were stranded when their armored vehicles got stuck in the mud. After being stranded for a long time, the soldiers realized how big a cost they were in. They chose to save their lives while surrendering to the Ukrainian people. They encountered the statements of Vladimir Rosso, another captured officer from the same, also reveal the Russian soldiers we have the occupation. Roka's statements is both a challenge to Putin and a call to his friends in the Russian army. My friends, put down your weapons and do not participate in this crime. I also appeal to Putin, stop the occupation of Ukraine as soon as possible. We will stand against you when we return to our home. Developments in the Russian army show that the army is on raving and anger against Putin is grooving. While the Ukrainian army is fighting with all its might, the Russian army's combat performance is gradually declining because the Russian army is also fighting at war within itself. What do you think?